In this section, we'll talk about the termination phase of case management as being part of coordinating, linkage, and monitoring. The termination process really starts at the beginning of the client-case manager relationship. It's discussed as part of the orientation and the expectations that the client can expect in describing what case management is all about. The termination phase can also be considered the evaluation phase, which calls for measuring the results of implementing the client's case management service plan and looking at the effects on the client's condition. It's an evaluation process. So as part of this training on the termination phase, let's just evaluate what has taken place before in the case management process to be aware of when termination might occur. We talked about self-advocacy skill development with the client, and we identified that there were 9 stages related to case management advocacy actions, including raising awareness, in which case managers share essential information with clients about their behavior and their perception of the client's state of engagement. And then the case manager would remain attuned to the client's ability to perceive what is shared and the feelings that the client expresses about responses to situations, while the case management remains supportive and non-judgmental. And throughout this awareness conversation, the case manager remained supportive of the client and met their duty of respecting the client's dignity and autonomy and respecting the client's rights. And as the client engaged in the case management relationship, the case manager entered the doing for phase, which time the case managers are raising the awareness of their clients to behavioral health conditions and continue to advocate for clients by doing for the patient. This was an important step to prevent the clients from experiencing unsafe situations or suboptimal care. It also was reflective of case managers representing those who are unable to represent themselves. An example was providing a client with information about NAMI and securing a schedule of meetings regardless of whether the client asked for such. So case managers in this phase do for their clients while educating the client about their condition, their needs, and clarify situations for them and simplify what might be conceived as a complex or vague system that the client is entering into. The third step of these 9 steps of engagement was counseling. And in this step, the case manager referred the patient for counseling as an act of advocacy to gain a better understanding of where the clients are at acknowledging their behavioral health conditions. At this stage, the case managers link the clients with professional guidance to assist them in resolving emotional problems and addressing the concerns or conflicts that may have arisen. Progressing through these stages was the 4th stage of doing together. And in this stage, the case manager assisted the client in their attempts at taking care of their own behavioral health issues. For example, together the case manager and the client might practice taking the bus. The case manager would demonstrate the behavior to the client and then ask the client to repeat it. Clients began to move away in this stage from detachment and reluctance, more towards engagement and empowerment. And case managers used a teach-back method to examine the client's degree of understanding and comfort with self-management and to determine areas for improvement and further emphasis. The 5th of the 9 steps is when the case managers support the clients in becoming the owners of the behavioral health goals and demonstrate effective self-management. Case managers became coaches to support clients in developing necessary skills and abilities to help them deal with issues and challenges before they became major problems. Coaching is an act of advocacy and can take place as a conversation between a case manager and their client, and clients can perceive coaching to be a positive and rewarding approach to self-management when the case manager helps the client explore their own behavioral health care goals and then achieve them. Moving into the 6th step, This is where the client started working independently, and case managers monitored the client's participation in coaching and continued support to reach a state of independence and performing self-care and self-management activities. In this phase, the clients were engaged, empowered, and comfortable in doing for themselves, and they were also able to seek case managers as needed. The clients behaved as well-informed individuals, and they're aware of their behavioral health condition and the importance of their health decisions. They develop self-determination and autonomy, that is, the expectation of adherence to care regimens. And in the 7th stage, ownership, the clients demonstrated rights and duties towards taking care of their own behavioral health and health care. They are responsible at this stage and accountable for making decisions, seeking information, or support when they feel the need to voice their own opinions about their options, needs, and interests. The case managers in this stage continue to assess, coordinate, monitor, link, and support the client as the client develops these skills and abilities for self-care and self-management and develops rewarding, effective performance. The case manager steps back and waits for the client to ask for their assistance in this stage, rather than forcing their support on the clients. And the 8th stage is mastery. At this stage, the client demonstrated grasps over their own health condition. They interacted in knowledgeable manners and made well-informed decisions, and they voiced what was in their own best interest. Clients were acting in a confident manner in this stage, free of self-doubt, actively pursuing information instead of being passive recipients of it, and demonstrated necessary skills and knowledge in self-management. And it is here where the case manager begins this termination phase of service and continues to support the clients and advocate for them by applying similar strategies as those of the ownerships phase. And in the 9th step, maintenance, the case manager is monitoring the ability of the client to conserve the mastery they have achieved over their behavioral health and health care. And this is important for ensuring that the clients continue to experience safe health conditions and quality outcomes. In this stage, clients are feeling empowered and consistent in demonstrating the full engagement in their health care. So when ongoing assessment and discussion with the client reveals that the client is making good progress towards his or her desired goals, this is motivating to the client. And the case manager and the client can decide to terminate the case management services or renegotiate a new service plan. But at this stage, the review is really an evaluation with the client to remind the client of where they were when they started, how far they have come. So reviewing the case management process, those 9 phases through which the case manager provided care to their clients, is a good idea. The case manager can remind the client what it was like during the screening process, that phase that focused on reviewing key information related to the client's health situation in order to identify the needs for health and human services. And then they moved into the assessing phase, in which the case manager collected information about the client's situation, including past and current health conditions, socioeconomic, financial status, services that were available, services that were not available, the client's self-care knowledge and their own ability. And then they moved into the stratifying risk stage. And this might be interesting to the client to hear it from this point of view now that they have attained so much mastery. In the stratifying risk phase, the case manager can share with the client how they looked at risk as in categories of low, moderate, and high in order to determine the appropriate level of intervention based on the client's interest and their own situation. When stratifying the risk, case manager completed a healthcare risk assessment, a biomedical screening, and looked at factors that were present, including health conditions, medications, substance use, nutrition, emotional and mental behavioral health, access to care, and so on. And then they moved into the planning phase, in which the case manager prompted the client to talk about what their goals were and help the client come up with a way to make those goals and measurable so that they could define baby steps or objectives that were also measurable. And during that planning phase, the case manager developed a case management plan of care with the client and the client support system. The plan was action-oriented, time-specific, and multidisciplinary in nature. It addressed the client's self-care management needs, care across the continuum, especially the services needed after an episode of care, for example, hospitalization or home care services. The case management service plan developed identified outcomes that were measurable and achievable. And then the case manager and the client moved into the follow-up phase, which focused on another evaluation and monitoring and a reassessment of the client's condition, the client's needs and their ability to care for themselves, their knowledge of the condition, and the treatment regimen and outcome of implemented strategies already identified on the service plan. The transitioning phase then is in which the client moved to prepare the client for discharge and to determine if other services or referrals needed to be made. And then there are a couple of more stages that can occur past discharge, including communication after discharge to find out how the client is doing, follow-up, and perhaps the agency follow-up post-discharge to see if the client is still continuing to do well a month or 6 months after discharge, and if there's anything that the client needs as they are continuing in their lives. Appropriately terminating case management service includes providing reasonable notice and securing the client and the client's support system's acknowledgement of and their agreement to the case termination, and if appropriately, effectively and efficiently transitioning the client to the next level of care. The service plan guides the client and the case management through the termination process. The case manager should ethically only intervene to the extent requested by the client. And once the initial goals are attained, additional change efforts are not begun unless the client requests them or agrees to this explicitly. If the client has no other concerns or does not choose to present additional problems, then the case management services end. When the case management process is terminated, the case manager and the client no longer see each other for the purpose of case management. The process of termination is not always as simple as it sounds, however, and it's important to give advance notice to termination so that dependence on case management is gradually reduced and the client's self-directed efforts are maintained and rewarded. Case management relationships with their clients eventually come to an end. However, the way they end and how the case manager handles terminations can have ethical and legal implications. Case managers should assess the client's ongoing services needs prior to initiating the termination phase with the client. NASW Social Work Dictionary defines termination as the conclusion of the social worker-client intervention process, a systematic procedure for disengaging the working relationship. It occurs when goals are reached, when the specified time for working has ended, or when the client is no longer interested in continuing. Termination often includes evaluating the progress towards goal achievement, working through resistance, denial, and flight into ideas. And the termination phases also includes discussions on how to anticipate and resolve future problems and how to find additional resources to call on as future needs exist. There are many reasons why case management ends. The client may terminate at any time for any reason. Ideally, termination occurs once the client and case manager agree that the service goals have been met or sufficient progress has been made and/or the client improves and no longer needs the case management services. However, there are many valid reasons that are available to review, and some of those reasons include services required are beyond the behavioral health services net that the case manager works within, and the client may need to be referred to another case manager set of services, such as developmental services or financial services. Perhaps the client has not paid for fees. The financial contractual arrangement was made initially and made clear to the client, and probably in writing, but the client, if it does not pose a danger to others, then the case management relationship might end because the client can no longer pay for those services. Certain circumstances may support a delay of the termination in this case. For instance, it's not recommended that a case manager end services with a client who's in crisis at the time of termination is being considered. Postponing termination is preferred in this case until steps are in place to handle the crisis. Abandonment is a specific form of malpractice that can occur in the context of mental health professionals' termination of services. Abandonment, also referred to as premature termination, occurs when a case manager is unavailable or precipitously discontinues services to a client who's in need. In a malpractice case based on abandonment, the client alleges that the case manager was providing services and then unilaterally terminated treatment improperly. The client must show that he was directly harmed by the abandonment and that the harm resulted in compensable injuries. The client's dissatisfaction with the outcome is not sufficient to establish the case manager's negligent. The client must also show that the termination was not his fault, that he kept appointments, complied with service recommendations, and paid his bills. It is critical to be able to establish both the reason for termination and the manner in which it's carried out. After beginning a client-case management relationship, the case manager must not terminate case management abruptly without referring the client to another case management practitioner. If the case manager does not properly terminate the client therapy relationship, the case manager exposes himself and his agency to allegations of abandonment, which could lead to a lawsuit, a complaint to the state licensing board, or a request for a professional review. Proper termination has been documented as a defense to abandonment allegations, and it supports good client care. Case managers should terminate services to clients and the professional relationship with them when such services and the relationships are no longer required or no longer serve the client's needs or interests. Case managers should take reasonable steps to avoid abandoning clients who are still in need of services. Case managers should withdraw service carefully under any unusual circumstances, giving careful consideration to all the factors that are at play, and take care to minimize possible adverse effect. Case managers should assist in making appropriate arrangements for continuing services when necessary. Case managers should not terminate services to pursue a social, financial, or sexual relationship with the client. Case managers who anticipate the termination or interruption of services to clients should notify clients promptly and seek the transfer, referral, or continuation of services in relation to the client's needs and preferences. Case managers who are leaving an employment setting should inform clients of appropriate options for the continuation of services and the benefits and the risks of those options. So in preparing for termination, you prepare for it from the beginning. Termination should be discussed early so both parties can have a number of sessions to discuss ending the services. If continued services are needed, provide referrals to several mental health case managers with addresses and phone numbers. And these referrals of 3, as a rule of thumb, is minimum. If possible, and with the client's consent, assist in transitioning to other case managers and healthcare providers. Conduct the final session, face-to-face if possible. Avoid ending with a text, avoid ending in an email, and avoid ending in a voicemail message. Make sure the client understands when, why, and how case management services will be terminated. Document discussions about termination. Formalize the termination with a personalized termination letter, not a form letter. And what should you include in a termination letter? Well, it's good practice for a case manager to draft a termination letter to every client once treatment has ended, regardless of the reason, to formally end the therapeutic relationship. This provides clarity to the client, and it helps avoid any implication that the case manager has an ongoing therapeutic responsibility. The termination letter would be in the form of a business letter and include the client's name, the date services began, the effective date of termination, the reasons for the termination, such as the goals have been met or the client's needs are beyond the scope of the the service plan goals, or non-compliance with service recommendations, or perhaps that the social worker is retiring or closing practice. Summary of treatment should be included in this letter, whether you feel further treatment is recommended. If continued treatment is needed, provide 3 referrals to mental health professionals with contact information. Present the letter in person during a session or send it with delivery tracking, and confirmation services or a certified return receipt. Retain a copy of the letter and deliver documentation in the client's file. Mark the letter confidential and don't mention confidential therapeutic treatment information in this letter. So addressing the termination of treatment is an important phase of the case management process. For termination to be handled properly, discuss between the case manager and the client in advance in a thoughtful and sensitive manner. It's best that the clients not feel that they've been abandoned for the sake of the client as well as the sake of the case manager. If continued services are needed, the case manager must make an effort to assist the client in obtaining ongoing services to ensure that these needs are adequately addressed. Proper documentation of the termination phase of the therapeutic relationship with the client will provide support for the case manager's efforts to meet the client's needs as treatment ends. Termination can be spread out over several weeks, but to avoid reinforcing a client's dependent behavior, it should not be prolonged any more than necessary. If the client seems insecure about termination, it may take several meetings to be sure the needs of the client have been addressed. It will be helpful for the client to review where they were when they were initially started in case management services in comparison to where they are now. Seeing all that has been accomplished is a great confidence builder. Most of us have been there, dealing with the patient who refuses to comply with our treatment plan, our service plan, a person who might be uncooperative or just generally unpleasant. For many of these clients, the stress and strain of their illness, their disease or injury, and the abrupt changes in their lifestyle have proven almost too difficult for them to bear, and it's oftentimes the case manager who gets the brunt of their frustration. While we've all had a case or cases that we've rather pass on, is there ever really truly a justifiable case that a case manager can terminate at will? Ethically speaking, no, with the exception, of course, of actual or threatened violence and, in some cases, blatant noncompliance or refusal to follow through with treatment plans or service plans. Furthermore, in addition to the ethical dilemmas these cases pose, there are also potential legal ramifications to terminating a case of which case managers need to be aware. The legal issues involve the potential for liability when case closure is done improperly. Generally speaking, there are 8 circumstances in which case management services can be terminated without question. The client passes away, the client relocates, the client cannot be located, the client is hospitalized or enters a group care facility or is institutionalized or is not available for services for more than 90 consecutive calendar days. Or the client no longer needs case management services because of changes in his or her condition or circumstances. The client refuses treatment, the client requests termination of services, or the client refuses to cooperate in the provision of case management services. As mentioned earlier, there is always a risk of liability when a case manager terminates services to a client or patient, especially if the client does not agree with the discharge plan. However, there is a distinct difference between terminating and abandoning a case. Abandonment, of course, is both an ethical and legal quagmire if it's determined that the case was abandoned and not properly terminated. To ensure that you're staying within both your ethical and legal boundaries, you must protect yourself against appearing as though you are abandoning the client when situations dictate termination. Clients who accuse case managers of abandonment must prove that the case manager terminated the relationship unilaterally, without reasonable notice, and when further attention was required. In some cases, it is in fact the client who terminates the services through his or her own actions, albeit perhaps unknowingly or unwittingly on their part. In home care, for example, when clients are consistently not at home for scheduled visits, the clients themselves are terminating the relationship. In such cases, always leave a written note indicating that the appointment or visit was missed and document this in the client record. You must notify these clients who are unavailable for a specific number of visits that they are constructively terminating their relationship with you and your facility and your agency. In most organizations, a limit of 2 or 3 missed appointments is warranted to discharge the client from services. Afterward, follow up with written notice to the client that his or her case is closed. Document the discharge in the client's record and notify the physician who might be working with the client as well. Keep in mind that when the client terminates the relationship directly with providers and everyone involved in the client's case agrees to the termination, the providers have no liability. Termination of services gets more ethically challenging in those cases in which the client's insurance no longer covers the service. In these cases, you can first suggest that the clients pay privately if you think that they have other resources. Document the offer and the client's response. If the client declines to make other payment arrangements, it is the client who is terminating the service. And finally, perhaps the ultimate ethical challenge, those clients suffering from mental illness or poor judgment, limited financial resources, and no available willing or able caregiver. Without your services, the client may suffer injury or further declining health. One way to approach the situation is to have a meeting or a conference with professionals who are part of the treatment team to determine a service plan discharge. This most likely will involve a community resource such as Adult Protective Services, and a realistic discharge time frame is 2 or 3 weeks. In many of these cases, you may need to arrange for transportation for the client if the discharge plan calls for a change in the client's setting. Should the client refuse any of your services or interventions, it is the client who is terminating your services. Document your discharge plan and the patient's response to all the recommendations and interventions. As with all the duties that you perform, documentation is the key to protecting yourself and your employer should disputes or questions about your actions arise. In cases of termination, documentation is especially crucial. Keep these tips in mind when proceeding through termination steps. The documentation has to be legible, and if you're using an electronic health record, that should not be a problem. Identify the time and date on every progress note and sign the entry with your title. Document all teaching performed and instructions provided to the client and/or a caregiver, and always include their responses. Be factual and specific in all documentation. Do not discuss agency problems or staff issues in a client note. To correct any errors or mistake in your documentation, do not attempt to erase or blot out if you're handwriting it. Always draw a line through the documentation and write mistaken entry above it and sign your initials over it when you're using paper documentation. Document all telephone calls, emails, and other communications with physicians, community agencies, and other team members. This should include explanations of what occurred with the patient, what actions were ordered and taken, and how they're implemented, and the outcome of those actions. This may be a difficult or uncomfortable situation for you as a case manager. Your goal is to do your best to keep your patient from harm. However, you need to protect yourself as well. Taking the right steps and documenting the process will protect you and the clients that you serve. So the termination process is an evaluation process with the client to look over the course of the services that were provided and the progress the client has made. Point out the client's achievements and independence. Share your positive feelings about the client and the relationship. Plan for a follow-up in a future date, and leave your door open should the client decide to reinstate case management services in the future. This ends the section on termination. Don't forget to take the test, and a passing score of 70% is required. Thank you.